My name is Arthur Finch, and I'm what you might call a man made of stone and patience. I spent 50 years of my life in the Oakhaven quarry, cutting the very rock that built this town. But the day my own flesh and blood, my nephew Mark, laughed in my face in a lawyer's office, I felt like I could crumble into dust. He looked at the will, then at me, and scoffed loud enough for the secretary in the next room to hear. An abandoned church? What are you going to do with a pile of holy rocks, Uncle Art? Pray for a miracle to fix the roof? He said it with a smirk, like I was the biggest fool he'd ever met. It's a strange thing, to be handed a memory and have everyone else see only a burden. What would you do if the one thing you were left was the one thing everyone else threw away? Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The lawyer's office was cold, not from the weather, but from the sterile, impersonal way life gets divided up on paper. My brother, gone. And all he had to his name, apparently, was St. Jude's, the old church on the hill. Mark, my nephew, a man who builds shiny glass boxes in the city and calls them homes, couldn't wrap his head around it. He saw it as a liability, a worthless piece of land holding up a crumbling structure. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, just offered me this pitying little smile, the kind you give to a child who doesn't understand he's been handed a broken toy. He adjusted his tie and slid the deed across the polished mahogany desk, as if he were disposing of something unpleasant. In that room, I wasn't a man who had built a town. I was just an old relic being given another, larger relic to look after. The silence after Mark's comment was heavier than any stone I'd ever lifted. The humiliation didn't end there. News in a small town travels faster than a summer storm. Later that day, I was at the diner, just trying to have a quiet cup of coffee, when the mayor, Bill Peterson, clapped me hard on the back. He has a booming voice that always seems meant for a crowd, even when he's 2 feet away. "Heard you're the new owner of the town's biggest birdhouse, Art," he bellowed. A few of the men at the counter chuckled into their cups. "Let me know if you want the county to condemn it for you. Save you the trouble and the property taxes." He winked, thinking he was doing me a favor, offering to tear down the last piece of my brother's life, the place where I married my Eleanor. The laughter wasn't malicious, not exactly. It was worse. It was dismissive, the kind of laughter that says you're not even worth taking seriously. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, left a few coins on the counter for the coffee, and walked out. I could feel their eyes on my back, the lingering amusement hanging in the air. As the diner door swung shut behind me, I felt that old, familiar weight settle in my gut. It's a feeling I've known most of my life. The quiet sting of being underestimated. They see these hands, calloused and scarred from the quarry, and they see a simple man. They forget these hands cut the stone for the library's foundation, for the steps of the town hall they now run. They looked at me and saw a sentimental old fool clinging to a ruin, and in that moment, a cold, quiet resolve began to form in my chest. It wasn't anger that would shout, but the kind that would build. That evening, I drove up the winding road to St. Jude's. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown graveyard. The building stood there, silhouetted against the orange sky, a dark, forgotten giant. The roof was sagging in one corner, several of the stained glass windows were boarded up or broken, and ivy was crawling up the stone walls like it was trying to pull the whole thing back into the earth. Anyone else would have seen what Mark and the mayor saw, a pile of holy rocks. But I stood there, looking at the bell tower where my Eleanor and I had stood after our wedding, and I didn't see a ruin. I saw a promise, a duty. I saw the last place on earth that held a piece of her, and I knew, right then and there, that I wasn't going to let it fall. Not without a fight. My life didn't start with much, and I never asked for much more. I was born right here in Oakhaven, in a small house that smelled of sawdust and my mother's baking bread. We were quarry folk, going back generations. It wasn't a question of what you wanted to be when you grew up. It was a matter of when you were old enough to follow your father into the dust. My old man used to say, "We don't build with dreams, Arthur. We build with stone. It's honest, and it's real." I suppose that settled deep in my bones. I never had the head for books like my brother did. My path was already cut for me, etched into the face of the same cliffs that ringed our town, solid and unmoving. It was a life of sweat and certainty, and for a long time, that was enough. I remember my first day at the quarry like it was yesterday. I was 16, all sinew and youthful ignorance. The noise was the first thing that hit me, a deafening symphony of grinding machinery, blasting horns, and the sharp crack of stone splitting under pressure. The air was thick, with a fine white powder that coated your throat and settled in your lungs. My father handed me a heavy sledgehammer and pointed to a slab of granite. "Start there," he said, and that was my only instruction. By the end of the day, my hands were raw, my muscles screamed, and I felt a profound respect for the men who did this every day without complaint. It was a brutal education, one that taught you the value of a day's wage and the simple pleasure of sitting down at the end of it. But it wasn't just brute force. Over the years, I learned the language of the rock. I could read the grain, see the hidden fault lines, and know just where to strike to make a clean break. There's a certain artistry in it, a quiet satisfaction in taking a raw, stubborn piece of the earth and shaping it into something with purpose, a lintel, a cornerstone, a step that would bear the weight of generations. While my brother was off at college, learning about finance and futures, I was learning about a different kind of future, the kind that you build to last, something that could outlive you. My hands grew calloused and hard, but they were the hands of a creator, not just a laborer. That was a distinction I held on to, a private source of pride. I met Eleanor at the annual town picnic. She wasn't from a quarry family. Her father ran the small hardware store. She had a laugh that could cut through the noise of any crowd and eyes that didn't just look at you, they saw you. I was a dusty, quiet young man, and she was like a splash of color in my monochrome world. I remember being so nervous to talk to her, my hands feeling too big and clumsy. But she just smiled, offered me a slice of her apple pie, and asked me about my work. She didn't see the dust, she saw the stone. She was the first person who ever asked me about the craft, not just the labor. Our courtship was simple. We didn't have money for fancy restaurants or theaters. We walked. We walked for miles along the river, we climbed the hills overlooking Oakhaven, and we talked. We talked about everything and nothing. I told her about the different kinds of stone, and she told me about the different kinds of flowers she wanted to plant in a garden one day. Our dreams were modest, a small house with a sturdy roof, a patch of land for her flowers, and a life spent together. It was during one of those walks that we passed St. Jude's, still active back then. She stopped and said, "That's where I want to get married, Arthur. It looks like it was built to stand forever." My brother, David, was the smart one, the one destined for a life beyond Oakhaven. He had a scholarship, but it wasn't enough. I saw the hunger in his eyes, the desperation to not end up like our father, like me. So I did what needed to be done. I took on extra shifts at the quarry, working weekends, taking the dangerous jobs no one else wanted. I never told him the extent of it. I'd just send him the money, telling him it was a little extra I had lying around. He never questioned it. He was too focused on his future to look back. I was happy for him, truly. His success felt like a shared victory, even if my part in it was silent, buried under layers of stone dust and exhaustion. And so, Eleanor and I were married at St. Jude's. I remember that day so clearly. The sunlight was pouring through the big, arched, stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in shifting jewels of red and blue. I remember the scent of old wood, beeswax polish, and the faint, sweet smell of the edelweiss Eleanor had insisted on for her bouquet. When we stood at the altar, I put my hand on it. It was marble, cool and solid under my palm. I felt a connection to it, a stonemason's respect. I made my promise to her in that church, a vow as solid as the foundation beneath our feet. I promised to build her that life we dreamed of, to be her rock. It was the most important thing I had ever built. We built that life with our own hands. I bought a small plot of land with the money I'd saved, and I cleared it myself. I used leftover stone from the quarry, pieces others deemed imperfect, to lay the foundation for our little house. Every evening after work, and every weekend, I was there, laying stone, raising walls. Eleanor was right there with me, not with a hammer, but with sandwiches and cold water, with encouragement, with a belief in me that was stronger than any mortar. She painted the walls, planted the first seeds in her garden, and turned that structure of stone and wood into a home. Fixing that first leaking roof felt like a bigger victory than any promotion at the quarry. Eleanor was the soul of that home, and the soul of my life. She was the one who understood the quiet language of my heart. She'd trace the scars on my hands and say they were maps of all the beautiful things I'd built for our town. She never once made me feel like my life was smaller than my brother's. In her eyes, I was a king in a kingdom of two, a man whose strength wasn't measured in dollars, but in dependability and love. When Mark, my nephew, was born, we'd visit my brother. I'd see the soft hands of my brother and the ambitious glint in his eye, and then I'd look at Eleanor, and I knew I had the richer life. We never had children of our own. It was a quiet sadness that we carried together, but it also bound us closer. Our life was a closed circle, just the two of us against the world. We poured our love into our home, our garden, and into each other. We supported my brother's growing family from a distance, sending gifts for Mark's birthdays and celebrating his achievements as if they were our own. We were the stable, unchanging part of the family, the roots in Oakhaven that allowed the other branches to grow towards the sun. I never resented it. My life with Eleanor was full. It didn't need anything else to be complete. Over the decades, I watched Oakhaven change. The quarry, once the town's beating heart, began to slow. The demand for real stone dwindled, replaced by cheaper concrete and steel. Young people, including Mark, left for the cities, seeing Oakhaven as a relic of the past. The town started to feel a little hollowed out, its foundation strong but its spirit fading. A sense of being left behind settled over many of us who stayed. We were from a different era, an era of craftsmanship in a world that now valued speed and disposability. The town, like me, was getting older, quieter, and more ignored. Then Eleanor got sick. It started slowly, a shadow that we first ignored, then couldn't. The man who could split a 2-ton block of granite with precision was utterly helpless. I spent our savings on doctors and treatments, my strength useless against the fragility of her body. The quiet in our house changed from peaceful to heavy, filled with unspoken fears. I sat by her bedside for months, holding her hand, a hand that now felt as delicate as a bird's wing. All the stone I had ever cut, all the walls I had ever built, couldn't protect her. It was the hardest lesson of my life. Some things you just can't fix. The day she died, the silence in our little house became absolute. It was a physical presence, a weight in every room. For the first year, I just went through the motions, working until my body was too tired to think, then coming home to the crushing emptiness. I kept her garden alive, weeding and watering her flowers because it felt like the last promise I could keep. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, and the loneliness was a cold, constant companion. The world had lost its color, and I was just a man made of gray stone, waiting for the weather to wear me away. Sometimes, on the worst days, I'd drive up the hill to St. Jude's. By then, it was already abandoned, the congregation having moved to a new, modern building in the next town over. I wouldn't go inside. I'd just park the truck and look at it, the place where my life with Eleanor had truly begun. I watched the ivy crawl up its walls and the roof begin to sag. I saw the broken windows, like vacant eyes. In its slow, dignified decay, I saw a reflection of my own grief. It was our place, and it was being forgotten, just as the memory of our love felt like it was fading from the world, known only to me. My brother and I had grown distant over the years. His life in the city was a world away from mine. We'd talk on holidays, the conversations polite but strained. I was a reminder of the life of dust and labor he had fought so hard to escape. He never visited. I think, in his mind, Oakhaven and I were part of a past he had successfully shed. So when his lawyer called, it was a shock. Hearing he had left me the church, the one place that tied us all together, felt like a final, confusing message from across the void. A puzzle I didn't understand. And that brings me back to where I am now. Standing in the shadow of that ruin, feeling the sting of my nephew's laughter and the town's pity. They see a foolish old man and a pile of rocks. They don't see the promise I made to Eleanor at that altar. They don't see the 50 years of sweat and sacrifice that taught me how to build things that last. They don't understand that this isn't about property or money. This is about honoring a memory. Restoring this church isn't a choice. It's the last piece of work I have to do. It's a final act of love for the woman who saw the man, not just the stonemason. And I will not let it, or her memory, crumble. The first few days were quiet. I started with the grounds, pulling weeds that were thick as my wrist and clearing away the debris that had collected against the stone walls for years. The work was hard on my back, but it was honest work, and it felt good to bring a little order to the chaos. At first, the neighbors would just watch from their windows, a flicker of a curtain here, a shadow there. I figured it was just curiosity, an old man taking on a big project. But then the whispers started, carried on the breeze from one porch to the next. They weren't loud, not yet. They were the soft, rustling sounds of a town making up its mind about you, and the verdict wasn't in my favor. It felt like they were watching a slow-motion train wreck, just waiting for the final crash. The shift from quiet curiosity to open amusement happened at Miller's Hardware. I've known Tom Miller since he was a boy stocking shelves for his father. I went in to buy a new tarp for the roof and some heavy-duty work gloves. As he was ringing me up, he leaned over the counter with a sly grin. "You sure you don't need a discount on a sledgehammer, Art? Might be cheaper in the long run." A couple of other customers in the store, men I'd shared beers with after a long shift, let out a chuckle. It wasn't mean-spirited, not exactly. It was the kind of casual joke made at the expense of someone you no longer take seriously. I just paid for my things, nodded, and left. The bell on the door jangled behind me, sounding like a little tin laugh. After that, the diner started to feel different. It used to be my sanctuary, a place where a cup of coffee could last an hour, and the conversation was easy. Now, when I walked in, a certain kind of quiet would fall over the room. Conversations would dip to a murmur, and I'd feel eyes on me as I walked to my usual booth in the back. I'd sit there and pretend to read the paper, but I could hear bits and pieces. "Poor old Art," one would say. "His grief has addled his brain." Another would chime in. "All that quarry dust finally got to him. Thinks he can fix that money pit all by himself." I was no longer a neighbor. I was a local spectacle, a topic of conversation, the town's resident sentimental fool. The coffee started to taste bitter in my mouth. My nephew Mark called about a week later. I saw his city number on the phone, and for a foolish second I thought maybe he was calling to apologize, to offer a hand. I should have known better. "Uncle Art," he said, his voice slick with false concern. "I'm just calling to see if you've come to your senses yet." I didn't say anything, so he continued. "Look, I know a developer who's interested in the land. He won't give you much, but he'll take the demolition costs off your hands. It's the best you're going to get. Let me help you put this thing to bed." He didn't see a church, or a memory, or a piece of our family. He just saw a bad asset on a balance sheet, and a stubborn old man he had to manage. The conversation ended with me quietly hanging up the phone. The physical work was a blessing because it left me too tired to think. I spent a week on the roof, replacing the shattered slates I could reach, patching the holes with tar. My body, at 72, screamed in protest. Every muscle ached, and my hands, which I thought were tough as leather, were raw and bleeding again. I did it all alone. Not one person from the town I had helped build stopped by to ask if I needed help lifting a beam or holding a ladder. They'd drive past on the road below, slow down to get a good look at the old fool on the roof, and then speed up again, shaking their heads. The solitude was a physical weight, as heavy as the stones I was trying to save. My loneliness wasn't just in my heart anymore, it was in my aching bones. Sundays became the hardest. After Eleanor passed, I'd started taking a long walk through town on Sunday mornings. I'd nod to families coming out of the new church, exchange pleasantries, feel for a moment like I was still part of the community's rhythm. But after I took on St. Jude's, that changed. People I'd known my whole life would suddenly find something interesting to look at on the other side of the street when they saw me coming. A warm greeting was replaced with a tight, polite nod from a distance. I was becoming a ghost in my own town, a visible but untouchable reminder of something they'd all decided was best forgotten. The path of my Sunday walk grew lonelier each week, the space around me wider and colder. Then came the teenagers. To them, the overgrown graveyard and the crumbling church weren't a sacred place. They were a dare, a spooky backdrop for their weekend antics. I started finding empty beer bottles and cigarette butts near the oldest headstones. One morning, I found a broken window pane on the north side that hadn't been broken before. They weren't trying to be destructive, not really. They were just careless, treating the place with the same dismissiveness as their parents. Every time I had to clean up their mess, a cold knot of anger and frustration would tighten in my stomach. It was a profound lack of respect, not just for me, but for the generations of Oakhaven families resting in that soil. It felt like they were dancing on our graves. The advice was relentless, and it always came disguised as concern. My neighbor, Martha, who Eleanor used to trade gardening tips with, stopped me at the fence one afternoon. "Arthur, dear," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "You can't keep this up. You're not a young man. This place is going to put you in an early grave." Even Bill Peterson, the mayor, caught me outside the post office and put a hand on my shoulder. "Seriously, Art, my offer to have the county condemn it still stands. It's a public service, really." They all thought they were being kind, offering me an easy way out. They couldn't understand that their help felt like a shovel, trying to bury the last important thing in my life right alongside my dignity. The final quiet severing of ties came in the mail. For 15 years I had served on the volunteer committee for the Oakhaven Public Library. I'd helped raise funds for the new wing, the very foundation of which was built with stone I had personally cut. Every year, I received a letter asking me to renew my position, followed by an invitation to the annual Volunteer Appreciation Dinner. This year, the letter that came was different. It was a formal, sterile note thanking me for my many years of dedicated service, with no mention of renewal. The invitation to the dinner never arrived. It was a silent, bureaucratic shunning. I hadn't been fired. I had simply been allowed to fade away, another relic no longer deemed useful. Mayor Peterson, it seemed, had found his favorite new joke. At a town hall meeting to discuss the budget, which I still attended out of habit, he was trying to explain why there wasn't money for park repairs. "Well, folks," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the hills, "we could always ask Arthur Finch to pray for a financial miracle up at his crumbling cathedral on the hill." The town council members and a few people in the audience laughed. It was a cheap shot, but it landed. In that moment, he turned my private mission into a public punchline, a symbol of futility and foolishness. I sat in the back, my face like stone, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. The laughter echoed the emptiness of the church. Some days the memories were a comfort. Other days they were a torment. I was inside the church, trying to sweep away decades of accumulated dust, when a ray of late afternoon sun broke through a grimy window. It hit the floor and scattered, just like it had on my wedding day. I could almost smell the beeswax and Eleanor's Edelweiss bouquet. I could almost feel her hand in mine, warm and alive. I sat down hard on a dusty pew, the broom falling from my grasp. The stark contrast between that vibrant, joyful memory and the cold, decaying silence around me was a physical blow. It was in that hollow space that the town's scorn hurt the most, because it felt like they were mocking not just me, but her, and the love that had been consecrated in that very spot. The autumn rains came early that year, a relentless, week-long downpour. I had managed to patch most of the roof, but there was one section over the old choir loft that I hadn't been able to secure properly. The storm found that weakness. I stood inside the church, listening to the steady, mournful drip, drip, drip of water pooling on the wooden floorboards. It felt like the sky was weeping along with me, or maybe it was mocking my efforts. Each drop was a reminder of my failure, of how big the task was, and how small I was. It amplified all the voices of doubt, my nephews, the mayor's, the whole town's. For a night, I felt like giving up, letting the rain have its way, and wash the whole place down the hill. Swallowing my pride felt like swallowing broken glass, but I knew I couldn't fix the roof alone. I called a local contractor named Jim, a young man whose father had worked beside me in the quarry for 20 years. I thought if anyone would understand, it would be him. He came by, took one look at the gaping hole and the water damage, and let out a low whistle. He walked around for a few minutes, kicking at the floorboards, then gave me a quote that was so outrageously high it was laughable. It was his way of saying no without saying no. "Honestly, Art," he said, avoiding my eyes, "you'd be better off paying someone to light a match to this place. It's a lost cause." He was just echoing the town's consensus. Even the son of an old friend saw me as a bad investment. The name came a few days later. I was in the grocery store, in the canned goods aisle, when I heard two women talking in hushed tones behind me. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their words were sharp. "See him? The one by the beans? That's the one. The hermit on the hill," one of them whispered. The name hit me like a stone. It was who I had become. Not Arthur Finch, the man who built their library steps. Not Eleanor's husband. Not a neighbor. I was an urban legend. A strange character in a local story. The hermit on the hill. The name stripped away my history, my identity, and left me with a caricature painted by their judgment and pity. I left my basket in the aisle and walked out of the store. The small repairs were draining my modest pension faster than I had anticipated. The tarp, the wood for bracing, the new panes of glass, the roofing tar, it all added up. I started making changes at home. My dinners became simpler, soup and bread, eggs, whatever was cheapest. I turned the heat down a few more degrees at night, wearing an extra sweater to bed. The financial strain was a quiet, gnawing anxiety that I carried with me constantly. It was another secret, another burden I shouldered alone. It felt like the church wasn't just isolating me from the community. It was slowly consuming the little security I had left, demanding a price that went beyond just sweat and sore muscles. My brother's family remained devoid of silence. After Mark's one cynical phone call, there was nothing. No calls on my birthday, which passed quietly. No letters. No one from that life my brother had built, the life I had helped fund with my own sweat, reached out to see if the old man was even still alive. It was as if by accepting the church, I had accepted a contagious disease they were all afraid of catching. I was an inconvenience, a loose end from a past they preferred to keep buried. Their silence was a different kind of humiliation, a deep, familial rejection that said, my struggle, and my life, was no longer of any consequence to them. I was truly, completely on my own. One evening I hit a wall. I was sitting on a broken pew in the fading light, my body aching, my hands trembling with exhaustion. I looked at the water stains on the walls, the peeling plaster, the dark, gaping hole in the roof. The sheer scale of the decay felt insurmountable. And for the first time, I let their words sink in. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe I was just a lonely old man clinging to a pile of rocks, chasing a ghost. What was I even doing here? The weight of the town's judgment, my family's abandonment, and my own physical limits pressed down on me until I felt I couldn't breathe. In the damp, musty air of that dying church, I almost broke. The next morning, I was back at it. I don't know why. Maybe it was just stubbornness, the same grit that kept me going in the quarry for 50 years. Around noon, I saw the mail truck coming up the long drive. It was unusual. The mailman always left my letters in the box down by the main road. He got out, walked hesitantly toward the church, and propped a single envelope against the heavy oak doors. When I went to get it, the address stopped me cold. It wasn't to Arthur Finch, Nahum. It was addressed to the occupant, Old Church Property. I wasn't even a name anymore. I was a legal designation, a placeholder. In that single impersonal line, I saw exactly how the world saw me. I was the old fool with the worthless property. And as I stood there, a cold, hard resolve settled into my bones. They could call me a fool. They could call me a hermit. But I would not be broken. But they all misjudged the stone. That's the one thing they never understood. I spent my life learning that every piece of rock has a heart, a grain, a story. And the heart of St. Jude's was its altar. It was a single, massive block of marble, or so it appeared. But I remembered it from my wedding day, remembered putting my hand on it as I made my vow to Eleanor. Even then, something about its perfect surface felt too perfect. After weeks of working on the roof and floors, I finally turned my attention to it. I ran my calloused fingers along its base, feeling for the truth of it. And there it was, a hairline crack, no wider than a spider's thread. Not of damage, but of design. It was a seam, fitted by a master craftsman, a secret language between him and whoever had the eyes to see it. And I had those eyes. I went home and got my old tools, the ones my father gave me. Not a sledgehammer, but fine chisels and a small, weighted mallet. They felt right in my hands, an extension of my will. Back in the dusty silence of the church, I knelt before the altar. I didn't pry or force it. I tapped. Gently, patiently, I followed the invisible line, listening to the sound the stone made, feeling the vibration through the steel. It was like a conversation with the man who built it a century ago. It took hours. The sun moved across the floor, painting the dust in long golden shafts. Then, with a soft grating sound, a sound of release, the front panel gave way. It didn't fall. It slid inward, perfectly balanced, revealing a dark, hollow space within. Inside, sitting in the darkness like a waiting heart, was a heavy box lined with lead. It wasn't large, but I could tell by the way I had to brace myself to lift it that it was dense with importance. The air that came out of the hollow was cool and ancient, smelling of stone and time itself. I set the box on the dusty pew where Eleanor and I had sat during our marriage counseling with the old priest. For a long moment, I just looked at it. The laughter of my nephew, the mayor's jokes, the whispers at the diner, they all felt a million miles away. In that moment, it was just me, the silent church, and a secret that had been waiting for over 100 years to be told. The weight of it was more than physical. It was the weight of a forgotten history. The lid wasn't locked. It was just heavy. I lifted it, and the scent of old paper and dry leather filled the air. The first thing I saw was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was embossed with a simple cross, and the words, St. Jude's Parish, Oakhaven. I opened it carefully, the pages stiff and fragile. The first entries were in a beautiful, flowing script, dated 1892. It was a record of the church's founding, its first baptisms, its first funerals. But tucked between the pages were letters, dozens of them, written by the town's founder, a man history had painted as a ruthless industrialist. I began to read, and the story of my town, the one I thought I knew, began to dissolve. These weren't the letters of a cold businessman. They were the private correspondence between him and the church's first priest. He wrote of a great personal tragedy back east, of losing his family in a fire that was a consequence of a financial panic. He revealed that Oakhaven wasn't built for profit. It was founded as a sanctuary, a secret haven for families who had been ruined by the same disaster. He used his remaining fortune to build this town, to give people a new start with their dignity intact, away from the prying eyes of the world. He built the quarry not just to provide jobs, but to give men the honest, grounding work of building their own homes, their own lives, from the very rock of the earth beneath them. A profound stillness settled over me as I read. This town, my home, wasn't a product of greed, it was a monument to compassion. The hard, stoic nature of the quarry folk, the quiet resilience I had always known, it wasn't just a personality trait, it was a legacy. We were the descendants of people who had been given a second chance and had built a life on it. The founder hadn't been a tyrant, he had been a guardian. He had created a place where people could be safe. And here was my nephew, his own great-grandson, trying to sell off the very heart of that legacy for a quick profit, completely ignorant of the gift he had been given. The irony was as heavy as the lead box on my lap. As I continued to turn the pages of the ledger, something else caught my eye. Tucked deep within its spine were thick, folded documents. They weren't letters. They were old, ornate paper certificates. I unfolded one and saw the words, Bearer Bond. There were dozens of them. Beneath those were stock certificates for companies whose names were legends. Union Pacific Railroad, U.S. Steel. They were from the 1890s, left as a perpetual endowment for the town, a secret emergency fund to be administered by the church. The last priest must have died before he could pass the secret on, and the endowment was simply forgotten, locked away in the heart of the stone. At first, the meaning didn't fully land. I knew they were old and probably valuable, but I had no frame of reference. I'm a man who understands the value of a day's labor, the price of a bag of cement, the weight of a block of granite. These pieces of paper, with their intricate borders and faded ink, were from another world. But as I looked at the names, I felt a slow, dawning comprehension. These weren't just companies. They were the engines that had built modern America. And this church, this forgotten ruin, had been silently holding a piece of that foundation, waiting. The quiet in the church was no longer empty. It was humming with a powerful, unspoken secret. Swallowing my pride is one thing, but asking for help with a secret this big is another. I knew I couldn't go to anyone in Oakhaven, not even the bank. The news would be all over town before I got back to my truck. So, the next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I drove out of the county, 2 hours east to the city. I found a small, discreet financial advisory firm in an old brick building. I walked in there in my work clothes, holding a simple canvas bag, feeling like a fool. I imagined they thought I'd come to the wrong place, that I was looking for a loan. I just asked to speak to someone about some old family documents. I felt like a child playing with his father's important papers. The man they sent out was young, with a sharp suit and an even sharper look of skepticism. I sat across a polished desk from him, the same kind of desk where my nephew had laughed at me, and I carefully took out the bonds and a few of the stock certificates. He picked one up, his expression shifting from polite boredom to intense focus. He pulled a magnifying glass from a drawer, looked at the paper, the signatures, the watermarks. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he looked up at me, not at my clothes, but into my eyes. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice hushed, "where did you get these?" I just told him they were a family inheritance. He spent the next hour on his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The silence was deafening. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses. He looked tired and stunned. "Mr. Finch," he began, his voice careful, "these bearer bonds are untraced and still valid. The stocks, with over a century of compounded dividends, stock splits, it's He trailed off, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe the numbers on his screen. He wrote a figure down on a piece of paper and pushed it across the desk. I looked down at a number with so many zeros after it that it looked like a mistake. It was a fortune beyond my wildest comprehension. Enough to restore St. Jude's 100 times over. Enough to buy Oakhaven and everyone in it. In that moment, the laughter in the lawyer's office became a distant, pathetic echo. The drive home was surreal. The world outside my truck window looked exactly the same, but it was completely different. I was still Arthur Finch, the old stonemason, but I was also the guardian of a secret that could change everything. The knowledge sat beside me on the passenger seat, heavier than any box of lead. It wasn't a feeling of joy, not the kind you see in movies when someone wins the lottery. It was a profound, bone-deep sense of responsibility. This money wasn't mine. It belonged to the church, to the town's forgotten history, to the compassionate man who had built it all as an act of anonymous grace. I felt like I was just the next link in a chain, the next stonemason, tasked with keeping a foundation secure. When I got back to the church, I knew there was one more thing to do. I went back to the lead-line box. At the very bottom, beneath where the papers had been, was a small dark velvet pouch, tied with a faded silk ribbon. My hands, which can break stone, trembled as I untied it. I tipped the contents into my palm. It wasn't a jewel or a coin. It was a single, perfectly preserved, pressed Edelweiss flower. The same flower Eleanor, whose grandparents came from the Alps, had insisted on for her wedding bouquet. It was her favorite, a symbol of rugged beauty and devotion. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like a message sent across time, directly to me. Tucked into the pouch with the flower was a small, folded piece of paper. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. It was from the church's last priest, the one who had died so suddenly. The note read, "For the next guardian, may you care for this place with the love it was built on." That was it. Guardian, not owner, not heir. Guardian. In that single word, I understood everything. My brother, in his own distant way, must have known something. Not the details, not about the money, but he must have known the church was more than just stone and glass. He knew it needed a protector, not a developer. He left it to me because he knew I was the only one left who would see its true worth. He left it to the man who still loved it. I sat there on that pew, the ledger in my lap and the flower in my hand, and I thought about my nephew. I thought about the mayor, and Tom Miller at the hardware store, and the women in the grocery aisle. They had all looked at me and seen a broken-down old man clinging to a broken-down old building. They saw sentimentality as a weakness, a foolishness. They measured worth in dollars and cents, in property values and demolition costs. They had laughed at me for inheriting a pile of holy rocks, while all along I was sitting on the town's salvation. The greatest treasure wasn't the money, it was the truth. And the power was not in revealing it, but in holding it. And so my plan began to form, not out of anger or a need for revenge, but out of a sense of quiet, profound justice. They would never know. I wouldn't hold a press conference. I wouldn't wave the bonds in their faces. I wouldn't shame my nephew or correct the mayor. Their judgment of me was irrelevant. What mattered was the legacy in my hands. I would use this gift as it was intended, as a silent, anonymous act of grace. I would fix this church with my own hands, restore it to its former glory, and then I would use the rest to heal the town they were all so busy letting die. The hermit on the hill would become their unseen guardian, and my final act of love for Eleanor would be to save the town where we had built our life together. My first decision was what not to do. I could have walked into the mayor's office, slapped that old ledger on his desk, and watched the color drain from his face. I could have called my nephew Mark and read the 7-figure number from that financial advisor's note, just to hear the greedy silence on the other end of the line. The thought was tempting, a brief, hot flash of anger. But what would it bring? arguments, lawyers, greed. It would turn this sacred duty into a public spectacle, a fight over money. It wouldn't bring Eleanor back. It wouldn't bring me peace. It would just invite the world's noise into the one quiet place I had left. I looked at the single pressed flower in my palm and knew that my victory wouldn't be loud. It would be as silent and as resilient as that Edelweiss. The secret would stay with me. The plan unfolded in my mind, as clear and logical as laying a foundation stone. First, the church. I would restore it, not with hired hands, but with my own. I would use a small, untraceable portion of the funds to buy the best materials, the slate, the timber, the lead for the windows, things I could never have afforded on my pension. I would do the work myself, every stone reset, every beam secured. This wasn't a repair job anymore, it was a creation. It would be the last and most important thing I ever built, a testament not to my ego, but to my love for Eleanor and my respect for the craft. The church would not be a public museum or a tourist attraction. It would be my sanctuary, a place where the memory of our life together would be safe and whole. Then, the town. Oakhaven was dying not from a lack of good people, but from a lack of hope. It was being hollowed out by neglect. I sat down with that financial advisor in the city, and we created the Oakhaven Heritage Fund, an anonymous trust. Its purpose would be simple, to breathe life back into the town, quietly. The fund wouldn't build shiny new towers. It would offer scholarships to the children of families who, like mine, had worked the quarry. It would provide small, interest-free loans to save the hardware store and the diner. It would pay for a new roof on the library and fix the benches in the town square. It would do all the things the mayor said there was no money for, and no one would ever know where the money came from. The justice in it was strategic, and it was silent. I imagined Mayor Peterson, at a town hall meeting, puffing out his chest and taking credit for a, quote, mysterious economic upturn. I pictured my nephew Mark, hearing rumors of Oakhaven's revival, driving back into town, looking for an angle, a piece of land to develop. He'd find nothing to exploit. He'd just see a town that was healing, and he'd see me, his foolish old uncle, contentedly tending the rose bushes by the church's new oak doors. He would see the result of the miracle he joked about, and he would never, ever understand its source. His punishment wouldn't be ruin. It would be a permanent, gnawing confusion, a life spent on the outside of a truth he was too blind to see. In the end, I realized what they had all missed. They looked at St. Jude's and saw a liability, a pile of rocks. They saw no value because they only measured value in dollars and demolition contracts. But the real worth was never in the bonds or the stocks. It was in the story held within the stones. It was in the founder's compassion, in the priest's dedication, and in the small, pressed flower that was a sign meant only for me. I chose to honor that legacy, not to cash it in. I didn't need their apology or their respect. I had my dignity, I had my purpose, and I had the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the worthless thing they all threw away was the very thing that would save them. And that was a fortune no amount of money could ever buy.